So it is starting. Okay, so hello, my friends. So I am so honored to have a great guest here. She's an author and a practitioner. Her name is Benebell Wen. She wrote a fantastic book called The Tao of Craft, and she can't see me, but I'm holding up her book here.
Oh, yeah, I have no idea what you're looking at. So I'm so sorry. If I don't react to anything you're doing on screen, I don't see you.
Yeah, so that's my fault. I was trying to. I have two. I don't know. I'm technologically. I have a gremlin infestation. So she doesn't see that I'm actually here in my pajamas and clown face. So. All right, so let's just get right into it, Benebell. First of all, why don't you introduce yourself to people and give them a little background?
Oh, hi, I'm Benebell, and I wrote 2 books. The first book is Holistic Tarot. That was when I really wanted to memorialize all of the, learning that I've gone through on tarot. And then I thought I would pretty much stay within the Western mystery traditions, but then, I don't know, something happened. I took a circle back and I returned to my roots, something that I had really run away from for the majority of my life. And I started talking more with my mother, and I memorialized the oral tradition that my mom has passed on to me in my second book, The Tao of Craft. And that's what we'll be talking about today.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and I mean, we were talking earlier when we were having a great conversation, but I really enjoy this book. I think it is really well written, and it's very easy to follow. And I also like how you compared it to the Western Occult Tradition, which really gave me a place to begin, and to begin to kind of understand and get an insight into this, because it's actually. It's quite in depth. I did not know that there was so much involved in the. How would you call this, Eastern tradition, or what's a good way to describe it?
Esoteric Daoism.
Esoteric Daoism. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, the metaphysics, Chinese metaphysics.
Like you have it written in your book.
The title, Lei Loken.
Exactly, really. And so how did you get into, so you sort of touched on that, but how did you actually go about researching it and getting into the esoteric Tao tradition?
Well, in terms of Daoism, I think that it has always been a part of my consciousness and part of arguably my DNA, just by virtue of being ethnically and culturally Chinese. I know that's a very broad statement, but if you look at Chinese culture, even in modern day society, a lot of what they do is based on esoteric Daoism. From even all of our holidays, the way we celebrate, it's still based on a calendar that was started in, I believe, 3000 BC, the first calendar by Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor. So there's a lot of aspects of just our everyday culture, ancestor worship. Even if we don't say we're worshiping our ancestors, the idea that we're surrounded by people who have long passed and we need to kind of behave because they see what we're doing, that concept has always been integral to just being Chinese, or in my case, Taiwanese. And so I've always been Daoist, or had that consciousness in me. I think I just didn't use the word Daoist to describe that. And most Chinese and Taiwanese people don't identify as Daoist and won't say that, because there is a negative connotation in many ways to Daoism. I don't want to say it's negative, but how the Western mainstream might view the word paganism or witchcraft. Mm-hmm. So you kind of have that stigma attached to Daoism because of that strong magical aspect of it, because it dives into divination and alchemy and demonology. So because of its really strong roots in the esoteric, it doesn't have the best rap. So most people aren't going to be like, hi, I'm Daoist, so... But it is part of our blood, it's really such a part of us. And if you look into history, it's part of our history. Anyway, so I've always been Daoist, but I didn't have a label for it. And in fact, my mom identifies as Buddhist, even though she's nothing close to Buddhist. She's a Daoist through and through. I mean, she practices magic. That's not Buddhism. But, you know, I mean, she's like, I'm Buddhist. And I think, returning into scholarship and starting to study first Buddhism and then studying Daoism and starting to sort of parse through cultural practice and understanding the history and the legacy of what's going on between Buddhism and Daoism, I started to realize, you know, I identify more as Daoist, and the heritage I inherited from my family is more Daoist than Buddhist. So that's where that came from.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned kind of how that culture sort of treats Daoists sort of like in the West how people view paganism. So do people like in China, for example, or Taiwan, if they are practicing Daoism, do they kind of get discriminated, or are they kind of treated a little differently, or are they looked down upon? Do they have anything like that?
I think that's a really complex question, because it's a little bit different from paganism is that Daoism also maybe it's not different. I don't think it's actually that different, but Daoism also refers to a philosophy. So there's Daoism, the philosophy, then there's Daoism, the religion. And then in terms of Daoism, the religion, it gets even more nuanced, because there's people who might venerate the polytheistic tradition that is Daoism, but it's sort of one way, like they might pray to the deities, but they don't interact or commune with them. There's no invocations, evocations going on, and there's definitely no conjurings going on, right? Mm-hmm. And then you have like that aspect of it, the ceremonial magic traditions in Daoism. So that's really what my book focuses on, what I refer to as esoteric Daoism. And if you look back into history, the most influential aspect of Daoism in Chinese history is esoteric Daoism. You look at, for example, the Qing, which is his like awful emperor. He's the one, the terracotta army. He built the Great Wall. So like he basically, the Great Wall. So he bankrupted his country searching for the elixir of immortality. And in doing so, he basically retained an army of alchemists and ceremonial magicians the same size as his army, just to help him, you know, work through magic and find the elixir of immortality. And then you have, for example, the Yellow Turban Rebellion, which is when the Han Dynasty was overthrown and it became the Three Kingdoms. And that was led by an Eastern mystery tradition. It was basically led by magicians, people who were alchemists and sorcerers and who performed magic. And they led the rebellion against the Han Dynasty. So that's also why, people don't know necessarily, but that's also why over the centuries, there's kind of a bad rep attached to, you know, ceremonial magic. Because they always overthrow the government. So you can't like people who overthrow governments.
Yeah, well, I think that might just be kind of like maybe an inherent trait in people who work with energies, because they kind of like you describe in your book. They're really kind of on a whole nother plane of thought. They're not really into dominating and assessing land, or, you know, gathering land and gathering resources and subjugating people. They're into, hey, look, think for yourselves, go out, explore, improve upon your life, improve upon yourself, improve upon your family, improve upon everything. And so, yeah, you have an emperor who's kind of like, no, actually, I want these people to do nothing and work for me. I don't want them thinking for themselves. So, yeah, I can definitely see how that conflict would definitely come out. And you mentioned, I'm going to pronounce the word Wu Xing. Wu Xing.
Wu Xing.
Yeah. What exactly is a Wu Xing?
Wu Xing represents the 5 phases. So I think a lot of people constantly associate it with the 4 elements. So in the West, the Aristotelian 4 elements, you have fire, water, air, and earth. My understanding of the Aristotelian or the Western tradition is that they tend to be more fixed. Do you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So fire and air tend to be assigned a more masculine, and you could even arguably say yang or yang quality, whereas water and earth are given a more passive quality. But these are seen as essential natures. So if something is fire, whether it's in astrology or whether it's in elemental dignities, if it's fire, it's seen kind of as a fixed state. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. But in Chinese, so we have one of the wuxing is fire. Fire is not seen as a fixed state. It can be yin or it can be yang, and it more represents a phase. So for example, okay, a candle, right? So in the Western tradition, when you say this is fire, what you're describing is that the essential nature of this, the metaphysical essential nature of it is fire. It's a fixed state. It's what it is to its core. In Chinese, it's also fire, but we're saying fire is active. Mm-hmm. So this is an active energy. And no offense or anything, I feel like it's more scientifically advanced because we now know through science that there are this is like atoms and molecules are perpetually in motion. So the idea is that this object, the candle, is always in motion. And so fire represents the motion that you see that is the candle. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Whereas I think sense.
Okay, whereas I think when you say this is fire from a Western tradition, you're talking about its essential nature that's a little bit more fixed and grounded. Whereas in Chinese, we're saying it's emotion. The movement that's going on that you just don't see with your naked eye, that movement, that perpetual motion is referred to as fire. So the 5 phases represents everything in life is about change. Everything you see is happenings, right? So existence, metaphysics is about many, many, many happenings rather than actual fixed objects. So when you look around you, your computer's not fixed, your phone's not fixed, your keyboard and table are not fixed. They're in constant perpetual motion. Well, we use the 5 elements to describe that motion. That's why it can be yin and yang, because sometimes it's more yin dominant, sometimes it's more yang dominant. Whereas I think the Western tradition assigns it a little bit more in a black and white way, I would say.
Okay. So it's interesting. The way you describe the elements, definitely in the Western occult tradition, the elements are seen very fixed, and they're like a foundation of
a foundation. Yes.
The other elements are built upon it, and it seems like in esoteric Daoism, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, they're kind of viewed as like you described it. So I really like that description of it.
Good.
I'm sorry, I was distracted a little bit because I'm realizing that our stream is under a different name. For some reason it is, I'm still getting the whole YouTube thing worked out, so I just want to change the name. Yeah, it says Beltane script. It's not. It's interview with Benebell.
That's interesting. Okay.
Yes, exactly. So I just wanted to change that. So let me see. Let's see, where are we at here? So, okay. So about what is a Fu talisman? And there's also Sigil. Is there a Fu sigil? Can you do Fu sigils and Fu talismans, or are those two different things?
So whenever we talk about the Fu, so the Fu itself is a talisman when they translate it into English. So in Chinese, Fu is a noun. So for example, when I say Fu talisman to you in English, I'm actually saying talisman. You know what I'm saying? Because I say the talisman in English literally for the benefit of the West so that you can understand what the Fu is. So I say Fu talisman. But in Chinese, Fu is the noun. So I just say this is a Fu. And that is when they translated, before I came along, when it was translated into the English language, it was translated as talisman. My understanding is that talisman is a very broad term and it covers quite the gamut of magical things. Whereas the talisman, the Fu itself, is really about using writing and using Qi energy to run through you that connects heaven, earth, and man, the Trinity, letting that channeled energy go through the medium of writing and using writing as the magic. And that kind of reminds me of sigils. So it's really a sigil. A food talisman is a sigil. It is sigil magic. That's pretty much all it is. The difference is, I think, in the West, and again, I have an extremely superficial, very broad understanding. Sigil magic is one aspect of craft, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas in the Eastern esoteric traditions, the sigil is in everything. So it's part of every form of craft, essentially. Almost every form of craft involves a sigil. Even when they do astral travel, astral projection involves a sigil. Any form of summoning, conjuring, anything that you want to do involves a sigil. The sigil, writing is the way you connect to heaven and hell. Well, hell and I'm using it figuratively, you know. And so one of the beliefs, the cornerstone beliefs of craft in the Eastern tradition is that during the, I think it was the the Neolithic era, before the three dynasties. So in the Neolithic era, this is 10,000 BC, when the Yellow Emperor's historian Sangxie, when he invented writing, we say that the demons shook with fear. Because once man invented writing, they could use writing to communicate with heaven and also use writing to identify and name demons. And by naming the demon, by knowing the essential nature of a demon, control them. And so man can basically can control the various metaphysical realms because of writing. That is the importance that we place on writing. So writing, sigil magic, is the essential cornerstone of magic.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Fascinating. I apologize. I'm just overwhelmed by all of this because
sorry.
No, it's okay. It's just taking in all this information. It's really fascinating. And so we also talked a little bit about energy and working with energy. How does that play into Feng Shui? Am I pronouncing that correctly? Feng Shui?
Feng Shui. Uh-huh.
Okay.
So we believe that every physical matter, every physical component has a metaphysical component, an unseen life force, chi, energy. And we also believe very strongly in as above, so below. Mm-hmm. And so what happens at a macrocosm happens at the microcosm, and the microcosm is a perfect reflection of the macrocosm. So, for example, that's why they believe very strongly in astrology and numerology and all of these different studies. Now, as for Feng Shui, the idea is that, you know, all around you there's chi energy, right? And it's just a form of metaphysical chemistry where rocks and certain land formations and even, you know, electric poles and cars and just all of these things around us give off chi energy. And as they interplay with one another, they create certain kinds of combination energy that can then affect the people who are closest to that energy, right? Mm-hmm. And so Feng Shui is basically the focused study on the energy of where you're living or where you're working or where you bury your ancestors so that you can make sure that the energy is harmonious for your intentions.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And
Yep. Okay. Next question.
Well, it's just fascinating. That's all. I mean, I'm sort of a little familiar with Feng Shui and you know and it all, but so I'm just kind of like I'm stuck in this kind of absorption mode, so it's very difficult to kind of.
I'm sure you know Feng Shui. Feng Shui is very intuitive. When you, especially if you're sensitive, when you're sensitive or empathic, and I believe I've seen videos of you before when you describe yourself as empathic.
Yes.
And so when you walk into a particular area, you know, you can, even if your 5 physical senses don't see or hear something, you get a sense of that place, right? That's right. The chi energy in that place. Feng Shui is giving you a set of vocabulary for describing what you feel and what you know about certain places and how they make you feel. Maybe you just can't necessarily describe, I just feel this, I just feel that, but you don't know why. I see Feng Shui as just a set of vocabulary so you can start explaining and communicating what you feel to somebody who's not feeling it, who's not as sensitive. Mm-hmm. So it's intuitive too.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of like describing the way I've described it to people is it's kind of describing art to someone else or describing taste to someone. There's no way you can really describe it to them. They kind of have to experience it for themselves. Mm-hmm. And you can explain it. You can kind of give an idea to people what it is, but they will never really understand unless they kind of actually experience it for themselves. You know, and I think that is one of the true signs of a good teacher or a good guide is that they will not tell you the answer. They will kind of guide you in the direction where you can find the answer for yourself and experience it for yourself. Which kind of brings me to divination and the I Ching. I Ching. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Okay. Because I noticed that the elements, the three worlds, and the five elements can be broken down into those the I Ching symbols, where it kind of, you know what I'm talking about? I'm probably not describing it very well.
But no, it's perfect actually. So I liken the four elements in the Aristotelian four elements from the Western tradition. That's a little bit more like Ba Gua, the eight. So we see the eight as a little bit more fixed. So when we say, okay, what is the metaphysical world made up of, broken down into? And a Western practitioner might say fire, water, air, and earth, and then maybe spirit, right? So in the Eastern tradition, you would say the eight elements of the Ba Gua. The five wuxing represents more phases. It describes change. And the I Ching is the book of changes. So the eight trigrams, there are three lines basically, and each line represents either yin or yang. And that binary forms the three lines of the Ba Gua. And there's eight of them. So when you stack them up against each other, this is just permutation. When you stack eight, three against three, and there's eight of them, you get 64. So there's 64 hexagrams. And these 64 hexagrams represent the different changes that existence, chi energy, being can, go through. And you can be used as a form of divination. The idea is kind of like tarot. So tarot, you have 78 cards, and the 78 cards represent the compendium of life, of all of the aspects that life can manifest as. And that's what the 78 cards represent. So the I Ching 64 hexagrams is similar in that we believe that the 64 hexagrams represent the compendium of life that can express all aspects of human life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Because the I Ching is something that I'm sort of familiar with, but I never really used it as in the Western culture, or not Western culture, Western Occult Tradition. They will use primarily the tarot, but other people use the I Ching or runes or other forms of divination. Now they have like divination cards and the divination stones and various things like that. So I know a little bit about the I Ching, but not a whole lot. But I was fascinated.
I Ching is also used in magic. So you know how, for example, some people might use tarot cards or tarot card imagery in, their rituals, or for example, they might meditate on a card. Like there's different ways that people use tarot outside of divination, right? And so in the Eastern tradition, there's a long history of that as well. So for example, the 64 hexagrams, a Daoist practitioner might use a certain hexagram from the I Ching that represents the intention that they want to be manifested, and they'll use that hexagram as part of the sigil magic. So it's not just used for divination; it's used for many, many different things.
Mm-hmm. Which brings me into my next question, is noticing how, because we touched on it a little bit earlier when you're talking about the Fu sigils. But I also noticed that the way it's outlined in the book is that you can base it on the yin or the yang, and using the very element, the certain elements that represent certain things, you create the sigil using the I Ching using also the characters that represent various things, and also the yin or the yang about that. So could you describe, like, let's say if somebody wanted to create a Fu sigil for, like, let's say a house blessing, or would you go about doing it that way, or how would?
So yeah, this goes to how to write a book, right? So a lot of Daoist magic books, especially when you're talking about food talismans, it becomes a how-to book, like a very step-by-step. Step 1, you draw this. Step 2, you draw that. Step 3, you draw that, and this will do that. But for me, I guess the reason I've never really been into Chinese metaphysics is because of the pedagogical approach. It's so authoritarian. They don't really bother explaining why. And so I really want to go back to the ontological principles, the theory. So why do you do certain things in sigil crafting? Why do you see certain symbols? It's not arbitrary by no means. And so the first half of the book tries to show you the complexity and the nuances of sigil crafting. And the idea, the whole premise of it is that in order to control something, so, nature runs its course, and the only way someone like us, man, an individual, can control the power of nature is if if you can understand the identity of nature, if you understand nature. So on a very sort of way that people can understand that, a very common conception is that you can't summon a demon unless you know the demon's name. And that idea really strikes at the philosophy of magic, which is to make something happen, you have to have an acute and incisive understanding of its essential nature. What is its nature and how do you control that nature? If you don't understand its nature, you can't control it. You can't control fate. So when I talk about first Qi, that's to show you that there is this life force, this unseen energy. Now we have to learn how to control that energy. How do you control that energy? You have to know its essential nature. Essential nature, there's first the binary, the dichotomy of Qi, that's the yin and the yang. Then you have the concept of the Holy Trinity, the sacred Trinity that brings us all together. That's heaven, earth, and man. Then you get into the 5 elements. So one thing is, for example, in retaliatory craft, for example, in hexing, if somebody is, if you know that person, you have to know the individual that you're performing craft on. If you know that individual is fire dominant, then you're going to use sigil magic that really summons up water, that really harnesses the chi of water energy to attack fire. That is how you subdue fire. And that is all theory that you have to understand first before you get anywhere close to crafting sigils. And so that's the reason I explain all of that. Sigil magic is about, again, understanding nature and then describing it. So for example, in a home blessing, there's not one sigil. There's so many ways. It depends on how you work with Qi, your specific relationship with energy, there's so many factors, right? Mm-hmm. Now, how I would go about it, I use a lot of Feng Shui. So you want to look at the occupants, their essential natures, and then you have to look at the house, what that's like. And then the blessing or the sigil would be something that blocks certain energies and, invites or amplifies certain energies. And that's the sigil that would, in a sense, bless the home. That would be something more specific. If you wanted just like an amulet or something that's like a general home blessing for anybody, then a lot of times what they do is they call on the Qi energy of certain aspects of public consciousness. So we have blessings, prayers, mantras, right? So these, we believe that over the centuries, because of all of the people who have added spiritual value to these mantras, prayers, or certain blessings, that blessing by itself, due to all of the power accumulated from centuries past and ancestors past, holds power. So you use that mantra or you use that blessing to, bless the home or to create a certain type of energy because you're relying on the power it has accumulated over the centuries.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because I also like in that book, just when you touched on it there, you were talking about hexing, where if somebody had a fire personality or fire element, you would use water against them, because that's the opposite of fire is water in the Tao system. And also, for example, I think I was reading that if somebody, so you would have complementary. So wood would be complementary to fire. So if you wanted to strengthen someone who was fire, you would use wood.
Use wood.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Okay.
And also, when you learn these ontological foundations, you understand, for example, Bazi. That's Chinese. Bazi is like Chinese fortune telling. It's like astrology. It's like natal astrology, but it's not really astrology. Right. Understanding how people are. And also when you do compatibility, love astrology, right? When you see whether or not two people are compatible, or even whether you're compatible with your home, whether, also the nature of certain countries. So for example, the United States is considered more fire. Mm-hmm. So.
Now you touched on that astrology. Now is that the animal zodiac, or is it a Chinese zodiac?
So Bazi is based on this thing called a sexagenary calendar, and it's based on a 60-year cycle. And that 60-year cycle runs through the 12 animals of the zodiac, but it also runs through what we refer to as heavenly stems and earthly branches. I mean, that's all in the book. I don't know how to explain it. Like,
okay. You mean I'll actually have to read that?
Yeah. It's like trying to explain, deacons or something like that in like a second. But yeah, I mean, there's just different components to it, right? And then you just put it together, and that is kind of like a form of astrology. But it's not astrology, because astrology is kind of looking up at, the arrangement, the constellations of planets and celestial bodies at a particular time from particular coordinates. And that's how I see astrology. So the Chinese fortune telling isn't exactly that. It's based sort of on this 60-year cycle and what I was just describing to you, permutations and combinations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me see. And so we touched on Buddhism, and I think the best way I would describe it is kind of like Chinese pantheons. So is there one Buddha, or are there like different forms of Buddha? And how does Buddhism relate to a Chinese pantheon of gods? Or are they similar? Are they different? How do they interact?
So it depends on so here's the thing. You know how you have the Roman pantheon, you have the Greek pantheon, the Norse pantheon, the Celtic pantheon. And, even looking at Europe, right, you have all of these vastly different pantheons of deities, but really, there are certain concurrent archetypes that's kind of run through them all, right? And then we start making associations. Oh, this deity from the Roman pantheon is kind of like this deity from the Greek. We always make these comparisons. So China is not homogenous. It's so big, and there's so many, and for so long, and think about the history, and for so long, way before the times of internet, things like rivers and mountains completely separated people. And so you had two entire villages on two separate sides of the mountain doing very different things. So for example, in modern day society, we might draw associations with Beidi, a northern god. And I think it's Xuanwu, also a northern god, but that's from the south. So Xuanwu is more from a southern Chinese pantheon. Beidi is more of a northern Chinese pantheon. And Buddhism comes in really because in Chinese history, the running religion was basically whatever the emperor says. So whatever religion the emperor was, that became the national religion. So let's say, Lei Loken, you and your mom and dad, you guys all grew up Daoist, right? And then all of a sudden during your lifetime, you're like a 20-year-old or 30-year-old, the rulership changes, and now all of a sudden there's a Buddhist emperor. Guess what? You're Buddhist now. And not only that, but the temple you used to venerate and worship at, they literally just do like renovation and turn your Daoist temple into a Buddhist temple. And so that's how over time, things get very, very messy and very, very conflated. Now you grow up with this kind of like Buddhist, Daoist, like hybrid belief system, and you're going to pass it on to your children. And so that's what happens. That's why there's such a conflation between Buddhism and Daoism in actual practice among the Chinese. And also a lot of the esoteric Daoist traditions when you're talking about esoteric Daoism, there's many different lineages, like traditional practices. There's different, there's just different lineages. And so some of the lineages within esoteric Daoism, they're mystery traditions, they're very heavily focused on the Buddhist pantheon. So even though they're Daoist and they're practicing magic, ceremonial magic, they invoke Buddhist deities. Well, not even they're like, it's Buddha or Quan Yin or certain Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, but they treat the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas as deities that they invoke within their practice. And I'm just objectively describing how the various lineages practice. So that's why there's the conflation between Buddhism and Daoism.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and I mean that's actually very, again, another parallel. It's very similar to Western culture. For example, Chartres. Chartres in France. Chartres was a very strong Druid, which was the Celtic priesthood, temple. And they just kind of, Christianity came in, and they just kind of like said, okay, well, you're all Christians now. Oh, we are? Oh, okay, all right. And we're going to take your temple and we're going to devote it to our God. And so it, I'm oversimplifying it, but yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. It's kind of like, okay, so the king says we're Christian, so all you pagans, we are now Christian.
Yeah, I saw that when I traveled through Europe. I saw that you see a lot of that in the relics there and the landmarks. A lot of they'll say when the tour guides will describe, oh, this used to be a pagan this or that, and then then there's a cross. I'm like, but why is there a cross there? Oh, and then it was turned into a church. I'm like, okay, interesting.
Yeah, so. It's really fascinating. When I had a chance to go to Europe a couple of years ago, I went to a lot of old churches in Ireland, where they have a Sheila Nagig, you've probably heard of that, image. And what it is it's an old pagan fertility symbol. And it also warded off evil. And so you will go into this old Christian church, and over in the corner, a lot of times what they did was they chiseled them off. They took them off because it was considered to be offensive. But sometimes you'll see it there, and it'll just be in the corner there, and it's a little Sheila Nagig, and it's kind of like a little ode to the old pagan ways. Yeah. So yeah, I can definitely relate to that. So it looks like we've got a couple of questions here. So actually, yeah, Melanie Weber says, can you give a couple examples of how we could use Fu magic for the public good, to help us overcome societal hatred, or to be a more loving society, for example?
Oh, that's interesting. So I have a couple of instructables, like free downloads on my website, if you want to just get a sense of how to actually implement Fu talismans. In terms of for the public good, how do you use sigil magic for the public good? I think there needs to be a will to change. And so if the public good, the public consciousness doesn't want to change, and they're resisting the energy that you're sending that way, it's blocked. I mean, it's in a way, magic kind of corresponds in a lot of ways to science and our understanding of science, right? So you can send something my way, but if I block it, or if I'm not there needs to be a recipient. There needs to be receptivity to what you're sending out in a way, I know that doesn't make a lot of sense when it comes to certain things that we do on people when they don't want it done to them, which is not always for the public good. But I think that's different because there is such an energy. It's all about just like forces. It has to overcome whatever, so basically your energy has to be stronger than their energy to overpower them. Does that make sense? So if public consciousness is too strong and too resistant to the energy, the love, and the compassion that you're sending out, it's very difficult. The only thing you can do is to just continue. And this isn't even about sigil magic. This is sort of how I view life. You can just be a continued beacon of compassion and hope that by really just, accruing that, it becomes strong enough that at some point it overcomes. But I don't think it's that easy where there is sigil magic that can overcome public consciousness if public consciousness isn't ready to receive that level of compassion.
Right. Yeah.
That might be a very pessimistic view on things, but I'm sorry. as a pessimist.
No, I absolutely agree with you. I think that it is. Yeah, I mean, it's not that we can change an entire culture's consciousness. That's just not possible. I mean, there's just too much independent thought, too much will, and yeah, you are right. I mean, one of the things that we can do is I kind of like look at it as what do you call it? There was a button I used to wear. It's called think globally, act locally. So basically what that was you are trying to change on a macrocosm level, but what you're doing is you're starting at the microcosm level. So you, throughout your day, are trying to change thought that eventually, hopefully, will have a larger effect and will change consciousness in that way.
I think that best sigil magic for changing public consciousness is sigil magic targeted at yourself, where you use the magic on yourself to truly hope that you can achieve your own highest good, and that you can always do as you say and reflect compassion and reflect love. And if you can do that, I do see it really, I mean, like, it's cliche, but I really see it. I see that if I act a certain way, you can see how people around you reflect that and they act a certain way. And by being higher, you raise the vibration of everybody around you and you push them higher. When they're higher, the ripple starts to go out and they push everyone around them higher. And eventually you can, in that sense, as a single individual, raise public consciousness. So you have to start, I mean, again, it's cliche, but I think that would be what I would recommend. Start with sigil magic on the self to ensure that you truly are authentically always living up to your highest good.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I just got really light and fluffy there, didn't I, Littleton?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, it's you have to have, like you say in your book, you have to have a balance. You have to have a balance of fluffiness and that kind of I don't want to say dark, but I mean that kind of realistic, I think, is a better way to say it. I mean, because there is that sense that when it comes down to it, people who practice magic, they want to cause change, and that's just the way it is. If it's change for themselves, for the better, or if they want to change something else. The whole purpose, in my opinion at least, is to cause change. And many of us who begin to study and look at ourselves, we find that the first thing we have to do is we have to change ourselves. We have to work on ourselves. And that can often mean various aspects of our personality that we have to recognize, we have to confront, and we have to integrate and accept. So anyhow, I got a little fluffy there too for you.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did.
So okay, so we have another question from Renee Yin. I'm half Asian, and sometimes it's a struggle to mix East versus West in my esoteric practice. Any thoughts or tips?
I mix East and West. I very much mix that. If you look through my personal journals, my own book of methods, that's our correspondence with the grimoire, or maybe the book of shadows. The Chinese word is book of methods. It is a huge combination. I think instead of trying to be authentic to a Western tradition or authentic to an Eastern tradition, you just really make sure you're as educated as possible. You read and you really inform yourself, and you find what resonates with you. And I know a lot of people a lot of times talk about cultural appropriation or picking and choosing. Daoism by nature, Daoist magic, esoteric Daoism is very eclectic. If you can see, they pick and choose and cherry pick from Confucianism, legalism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Shintoism, and then when the diasporic Chinese left the mainland and went to other countries, it integrated with the cultures of the new places. We're talking about Southeast Asia, And we're talking about Europe as well. And so Daoism itself, Daoist magic, is very eclectic. It's all about, that's why I think I talk so long and extensively about the theory of magic, the theory of energy. The energy itself is not cultural specific. You just have to understand how energy works. The Daoist framework or vocabulary is one way of understanding it. So if you're of multiple cultures, which is just the reality of everybody these days, even I, although I'm 100% genetically, not even genetically, that's not even, race isn't even a genetic thing. But, even though my parents are both from Taiwan, I grew up here. I was born and raised in the US. And so for me, I really feel more connected to tarot and the Western tradition. In fact, I started in the Western tradition and only in my adulthood moved back into the Eastern tradition. But, if you learn four elements, it's really hard to kind of transition. So you just understand. And again, you use what works for you. Understand the why of your actions and you can't go wrong. So just go ahead and blend the two in a way that's seamless for you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. I agree with you. Okay, Melanie says, I get it. I'm just hearing from empathetic people I know that all the hatred being out in our country right now might be a reaction to the spiritual changes we are experiencing as a society. So I guess that's more of a comment, Melanie? So, yeah.
I agree with that comment. I absolutely agree with that comment. It's big. I mean, that's a huge conversation. It's a huge discussion. How do you change the world is basically what she's asking, how do you change the world? How do you manifest world peace? Well, isn't that the question?
Yeah. And if I can pull my soapbox off, dust it and climb on it for a second. I think that we get too wrapped up in thinking that other people have to come in and change. Like we have to impose, we have to make laws, we have to do this, we have to change that, we have to get our government to do this. It's kind of like, no, individuals just have to do it. And I think that one of the things we have to do is we have to stop getting so wrapped up in race. That's just my opinion. I think that there are much more things that everyone has in common, and we have to find that commonality and focus on that commonality. And I grow very frustrated because I feel that so many people are really focusing on the differences. And so what that is doing is that's amplifying that. And that, in my opinion, is it's kind of like we're stuck in a loop. And it's very, very frustrating to see kind of like this replay of the same thing over and over again. And it is. It's not an easy thing. We're not going to be able to change it by making laws or getting our government to do things. It's going to have to happen on an individual conscious level. So I think that for myself, if I can change my individual, my consciousness, it is going to have an effect. That's how I look at it.
And I mean, not to get super fluffy, but it really does. It's local. Is local and is individualized. So even though on the greater scale, the greater national scale, you do see a lot of hate, you see all of that, everything that she's saying is going on. But what happens when certain towns, and you hear about this in the news, when a mosque and a church get along really well, they go to each other Sunday, Saturday, they go to each other's events, they're really close, they help each other through times of need. Or when you see these, or stories of when the police officers and the activists from the Black Lives Matter camp, when they get together, it all begins because certain people were willing to let down their guard and not be defensive and be very loving and be more vulnerable. And then the other person, like I said, they go to your level. You go down, they're going to go down. You go up. I guarantee you people will go up eventually if you can really stay strong at that higher vibration. And that's what happens when you see at the local level. If you can really multiply or amplify that, that's how you make world peace.
Definitely. All right. Okay. So let's see. So Melanie says people are afraid of that spiritual change, in other words. So yeah, I would agree, Melanie. I think that people are afraid of that change. But it's up to the individual to change. Really, they don't have to change.
Yeah. That's very important. Mm-hmm. Live and let live.
There you go. Exactly. And Renee Yin says, thank you.
Thank you. And if you have other questions, please email me. I mean, my email or contact me. I'm very active on social media. You can definitely reach out. I'm always here to try to, connect with people.
Mm-hmm.
So
and it looks like if they go to your website, www.benebellwen.com, it looks like you have all your links there, right? Like you have the link to your blog and to your Twitter and your YouTube. So that would probably be a good place for them to start, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And download lots of free stuff. There's stuff there that you can start working on.
Ooh, good. Free download. So how would somebody go about doing that? Is there like a certain place that they look for that?
No, my website's a very hot mess. I don't have a fancy web designer. I did it myself. The whole thing was done by me, and I am not a web designer or a graphic designer. So I did all that shit myself. It's all over the place. But so for example, free tarot downloads is going to be under tarot. And then food talismans and sigils, and also things related to the Daoist Pantheon is going to be under the Tao of Craft. Mm-hmm. So, and there's stuff on Feng Shui and astrology as well.
Well, as long as people can find the information, I think it's okay. I have a website that's it's 20 years old by now. I mean, it's kind of I did it on the old Adobe Page Mill back when they had that. I know, exactly. And, but it works for me, and I have to go in and hand code it every so often when I need to update stuff. But, it's just there really just kind of for information for people. So Renee says she just bought the book. So I guess you went to Amazon and got your book already. So thank you, Renee.
Thank you.
And Renee, I've been reading it. It is huge. It is full of all kinds of information. So I had to sit down with a pen and paper. So a lot of information there. So let's see. Okay.
Quick insert. Sorry. So the foundation to food talisman and sigil crafting, there's actually this thing called the Huangdi Fujing. It's one of the first and the oldest complete text that addresses only sigil magic and how to craft sigils. And if you read it, it's actually broken down into the 13 principles of magic. And if you follow those 13 principles of magic, you can create and manifest any change you want in the universe, because you can control heaven, earth, and man. And it boils down to 13 principles. And that's one chapter in the book that basically translates this archaic text. And it took me forever to do the translations. So.
And would you mind going into those 13 principles, or maybe give us an idea of them?
I don't know them by heart. The first one is to acknowledge that there is a divine so the translations is really hard. I won't get into the complexities of translation, but one of them is basically that to acknowledge that there is one, there is a divine, there is a Tao, and then that Tao is subdivided into a binary, a concept of yin and yang. And that yin and yang is kind of like when they describe it in the text, because it's talking about deities, it's a lot like the God and Goddess principle, and then it asserts that the God and Goddess, the yin and yang principle, is actually just one. It's one principle, and that's the Tao, that's the Qi energy. Another principle is that man, the practitioner, can control any facet of heaven, earth, or man, and so that's the sacred trinity that we use, the vocabulary. You can control and create any change you want through your hand. And so the idea is that Qi energy, the unseen life force, can be controlled by a single individual through the hand. Another one that I really like is, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it's basically heaven holds no favors for an individual man, but any man can gain the favor of heaven. So the idea is that there's no the one, it's not like the Matrix. There's no Messiah. There's no the one, there isn't somebody in this world that heaven favors over another. We're all equal in the eyes of heaven, or in the eyes of that energy, in a sense. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. But an individual can ascend to the level of, I don't want to say to ascend to become godlike, but there is this where any individual who practices hard enough and cultivates hard enough can, through sheer willpower, gain the favor of heaven. Mm-hmm. So that's another facet that I really like. So there's these 13 principles, and basically, The assertion that I'm making, basically what I'm arguing in my book, the premise is that as long as you follow the 13 principles, your craft is correct. There is no right or wrong. In terms of like, oh, you have to draw this, you have to write that, you have to invoke the fire, water, air. What is most correct is following the 13 principles, because that is the text. That's what the oldest scripture on the topic talks about. And so if you want to follow the history and the legacy of sigil magic, that's what you would follow.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, and I like again, I keep falling back to the Western Occult Tradition to relate to it, but I find that that's the best way that I can do it. And again,
that's okay. I love it when people do that. Do it.
And also I appreciate in your book, because you also do that too. You give a relationship, which makes it easier for a Western culture, Western tradition reader to comprehend it. But yeah, the principle of the Trinity, as you described, the earth, heaven, and man, I see as in the Western Occult Tradition of the grounding energy and the lighter heaven energy is the best way to describe it, and then you bring it into yourself, and it mixes, and you become a part of both of those. So yeah, so definitely I can definitely do that description. Let me see, we have another question here. If Daoism, in her latest book, is intertwined with Buddhism by virtue of Taoism's eclectic nature. Let me read that again. If Taoism, in her latest book, is intertwined with Buddhism by virtue of Daoism's eclectic nature. I'm not too sure. Do you understand that?
Yeah, I wouldn't. So here's the thing. If you're looking at it from a more scholarly approach or a more traditionalist and orthodox approach, they're definitely not intertwined. They're very separate. Daoism is Daoism, Buddhism is Buddhism. The problem is when you get to the street level, is what I say. When you get to like the actual practice, the real people, the people who are practicing magic, the people who are, even just in Taiwan, southern Taiwan, a lot of people in Taiwan blend Daoism and Buddhism. So just the cultural practice of both arms gets conflated, and that's due to history, kind of what I described earlier, and it's just due to people really having that Daoist principles in their consciousness. Daoism is such a part of Chinese culture, but even Chinese people don't always acknowledge or understand it. So it's really part of our unconsciousness. And I think what I did was just put a name to it. And I realized that, all of these things that the culture does is actually Daoist. But yeah, there is a conflation, again, at the ground level. But if you're really talking about it from a scholarly aspect, then they're definitely not the same. They are very separate schools of thought.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. So again, relating it to Western culture, it would be like trying to describe paganism through Christianity, or trying to describe Christianity through paganism. Because I think that although there are similarities, and you can find similarities in almost all religions and spiritual beliefs, but to try and perceive one through the other, I think that's one thing when I debunk videos is I come across that a lot, where people are trying to look at paganism through the lens of Christianity, and then that creates problems for them. You have to look at it for what it is. And that's how I approach any other tradition that's separate from mine, is I have to kind of like drop mine and kind of perceive it as it is, rather than try and perceive it through my lens. But it was interesting in this book, it was kind of the opposite for me. I was able to actually relate to it by first seeing the relationship and identifying it through my understanding of the Western Occult Tradition. So I found it very interesting. Okay, one more question. If so, would it be possible for anyone to practice Taoism? If one on the street level, one can blend one's other faiths with Taoism.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in the first chapter, I talk about how first of all, it's very difficult to define what Daoism is. There are definitely, absolutely Daoists and who identify as Daoists who are not practicing magic, and there are people in the Chinese culture, in the Chinese society, who may not necessarily identify outwardly as Daoist, though they're using Daoist principles. They're using all of the ontological principles I talk about. But for example, my mom identifies as Buddhist, but she practices magic. So it's kind of like when you see some forms of witchcraft in the West, where they use psalms from the Christian, from Christianity. But they're not, what they're doing, that form of activity is not Christian. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So Tao is magic, like the magic where they're, for example, using magic or practicing witchcraft where you are invoking Quan Yin or Buddha or one of the other Pusas, like the medicine Buddha, right? Or Mo Li Zitian, another Pusa. When you do that, Buddhists would look at that and be like, hell no, that's not Buddhism, right? But we use the Buddhist pantheon to perform magic. It's just, there's no words for it. I don't even know what that is. It is what it is. That's just what they do. So.
Right. And that is, again, comparing it to the Western Occult Tradition, you look at the Western Occult Tradition, and it is filled with invoking the name of God to control spirits and to work magic. Yes. And so, absolutely. Yes, that is one of the things that looking at the Western Occult Tradition, you see Christianity in there. It was completely integrated into it, and there's several reasons for that. One is that I don't want to get into it, but there's
get into it. I love it. I love it. I love a history nerd. So.
There's I don't know how it was in the East, but here in the West, if you wanted to be educated, you became a priest, or if you were rich enough, you would send your child to a Jesuit school, or you would send them to a school that was Christian. That's how they learned how to read and write Latin, Greek. They taught everything, philosophies that, of course, were in line with Christian doctrine. If they weren't in line with them, they became kind of cast off to the side, and then in my theory, that became the occult. That became the hidden knowledge. But so people learned how to read, and then they related to everything through the Bible. So when they started practicing Western style of alchemy, which sounds very similar to Eastern because it's both physical alchemy and spiritual alchemy. But the physical alchemy that they practiced, they had to, in order to get kind of like the blessing or the funds from whoever they were working with, is they would have to invoke Jesus or invoke Yahweh or invoke God during it so that it would be acceptable. Because if they were invoking, Hades or Ares or something, they would be like, okay, send him to jail. So it was very interesting how how Christianity became a part of the Western Occult Tradition, and it is interesting. But if you want to live among, it's like, what do they say? When in Rome, do as the Romans. That's how you survive.
One of the key differences is that in the East, in Chinese history, so for because of how lengthy the history is, for actually the greater majority of history, and we always forget this, Daoists, so alchemists and ceremonial magicians ceremonial magic was basically practiced only by the aristocracy. Mm-hmm. So it was only among the aristocracy that practiced ceremonial magic. And witchcraft and shamanism was more at a folk level, where because, they didn't have access to medicine and the things that the wealthy had, they had forms of faith healing. So just in terms of the history, there is a large difference between people who identify as witches or shamans and people who identify as ceremonial magicians. And it historically, it tends to be a socioeconomic difference.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I found that really fascinating when I was reading back in time. And then I think the negative stigma that came, the stigma that came toward magic really happened, during I think it was the Qing dynasty. That was after the history of Daoism basically Daoist, ceremonial magicians overthrowing the current government, the current regime. Then eventually it gained that stigma. And then, of course, the Cultural Revolution happened. And when when communism took over, magic was definitely seen as bad news. And so all grimoires, book of methods, a lot of the magical texts and all of the records of lineages were destroyed during the Cultural Revolution. The only ones that remained were the ones that were smuggled out of the country.
Wow. Wow, that is, yeah. Again, so many different parallels, because that's kind of like the same thing, because all these books were taken they were not confiscated, they were captured and taken to the east, to the Middle East, during the Muslim, the Muslim Christian battles. And so we lost a lot of our knowledge that way. And so they were captured by Arabs, and then later on, we got those books back. So it was really interesting. And then there was, the whole Arab influence into it. So it was very, very fascinating. A lot of parallels there. And the one other thing you had mentioned, the aristocracy, the people who could afford it, practice ceremonial magic and alchemy here in the West. And also, again, one of my theories is that I believe that the people who came to deliver goods, like maybe, certain chemicals or rubber or wood or whatever, they would see these alchemists doing these various things or see notes, and then they would kind of like take that back home. And that's kind of like how I theorize possibly how witchcraft evolved into a more ritualistic form and kind of away from that more folk tradition, because they started kind of incorporating the ceremonial magic, what they saw, and tried to kind of, that's why it's kind of a little different, but it's sort of similar. I mean, it's just fascinating, because you go back so far, there's no you know what I mean? It's just, you can only really theorize about it unless you actually come across some new information.
Right.
So, yeah, it's fun. It's fun to look at the history of all this. So let me see. We got a couple more questions. Nobody here. That was the person who asked that question before. Says, thank you for that.
Hi. I know her.
Oh, you do? Oh, okay. The reason for my question is that my maternal grandparents were Buddhist Taoists. My mom is Catholic who practiced Taoistic magic.
I told ya.
Yeah, and she went on to say, I am now in the process of using my heritage to create my own spiritual path. My ancestors left China during the Qing dynasty that Benebell spoke of and landed in Indonesia, Dutch East Indies. Oh, okay. Wow.
Cool.
So, let me see here. So we're at the 8:30 mark. We have about 15 minutes left. So I don't want to go over your time. Are you okay, Benebell?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay.
My schedule is clear for you, Leiloken.
Okay, all right. Let me see. Okay, so we talked about yes. So if people, you mentioned you mentioned your website where people can go and download stuff. But where else can people find, like, let's say they do want to purchase your book, or books, I should say, because you've written 2 of them so far, the Tao of Craft, and then the other one was the
Holistic Tarot.
Holistic Tarot. So if people wanted to get those books, where's the best place for them to get it?
I guess Amazon.com. In the United States, it's Barnes & Noble. So just regular bookstores. If it's not at a regular bookstore or you're outside of the United States, I think Amazon's probably your best bet.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you can just go to Amazon and get it there. Okay.
Yeah, it's traditionally published. It's published by North Atlantic Books. So.
Oh, okay. And if people, do you offer other services? Like, do you do counselings with people or divination sessions? Anything
I was
like
doing
that?
readings. I did readings, but then it just really, I think it took over my life. Like there were just too many reading requests, and so I had to scale back. And so I closed it for now to focus on the book launch. And so I don't do professional readings right now. Anyone who has emailed or contacted me in the past, I hope can vouch for this. If you contact me, we can have a conversation. I don't do counseling, I don't do teaching, I don't do any of that, but I do a lot of sharing. And so if people have very specific questions, I do a lot of sharing one-on-one, and I'm more than happy to talk to people.
Okay. And I know you write a blog too, which people can access from the website.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And do people follow you around on Twitter?
I think so. Yeah, you can follow me around on Twitter. So okay. Twitter and Instagram. I'm always tweeting. Well, not as much these days, but I'm always on Instagram. So you can find me on Instagram.
Now, Instagram is something that I have an Instagram account, but I'm just not that active in it. Do you find it's really a good way to connect with other people? I mean, what's your opinion on that?
I like connecting with other people through Instagram. Facebook is much better at having more personalized contact with people. I mean, for me, Instagram is very superficial. I just like posting pictures of my food. I'm Asian. I post pictures of food and I go like this and I take selfies. I mean, what do you want me to do? And then Instagram is the perfect forum for an Asian girl. And so of course I have an Instagram account. So it's not really a cult or anything like that. Sometimes I'll post a couple of shots of what I'm doing a little bit, but it's all very light. I don't do anything. I mean, I'm not going to take a camera into certain places. So, it's very light and fun.
So no sensitive photos, but lots of photos of you downing a hamburger or something like that. Okay. Yeah. Let me see what else. So let me see. Oh, okay. So let me see. I had another question for you that I thought was very fascinating about your book. It looks like those are the Chinese writings for the various symbols, that just mean various things like one would put onto a sigil. Let me see. There was.
There's Chinese. So first, when we talk about ancient script, what sigils look like, and I try to describe what many different alchemists and ceremonial magicians over history have said. So it's all over the place. That's why I say you can't really teach a how-to step-by-step on sigil crafting, because that, for one, that's very specific to traditional lineages. If you're part of a lineage, then you wouldn't get my book. You would just do whatever your master has taught you. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. But if you're not part of a lineage, then it's kind of a free-form, eclectic sort of thing. So I offer you so many different perspectives of how sigil crafting has been executed over the centuries, and hope that you find one that resonates with you. One says that the sigils look like the footprints of birds. And that's going to be because they use Chinese oracle bone script. And Chinese oracle bone script is the oldest historically documented form of Chinese writing. Then you have people who say it looks like the condensation of clouds, and that's a very specific art style. It's the cloud writing or cloud script style of sigil crafting, and there's illustrations of that in the book. So there's just different forms of it. But the Chinese characters you find in one of the appendices. So I give a kind of some place to start. If you want something for love, or if you want something for, improving your career or a home blessing, that kind of thing. There are certain blessings, mantras, and Chinese characters that we believe over time hold some kind of power that you can use upon. Sigil crafting is about, how sigils in the Western tradition, you take something that is coherent, but you kind of make it incoherent to people who don't know what it is. You transform it and you transfigure it into something that's magical to you. Does that make sense?
Right.
So it's the same thing. You take Chinese characters that I show you in the book, but you have to transform it into something that is magical to you. And that's actually what the Chinese magicians would do. they would take Chinese characters and transform it. So most Chinese people who are literate in Chinese look at the sigils, they can't necessarily read it. They don't necessarily know what those characters are because it's not Chinese anymore. Does that make sense? It's already something different. Only people from that tradition or from that particular lineage know what it is. And so that's what I'm teaching you to do. Use the characters, but use the characters and transform them into your own magical sigils and use that as part of your craft.
Mm-hmm. Now you mentioned traditions. Now, are there were there and are there now sort of schools of esoteric Taoism that would maybe use their own certain characters that you would outline previously to make sigils?
Most well-known it's a perfect question. So there's the Mao San, Tianzi, Zheng Yi. There's so many different traditions. That's like maybe saying Golden Dawn, Rosicrucian, Wicca. Like, do you see what I'm saying? That's kind of, or heathen. It's kind of like that, right? There's just different like traditions, and they all fall under that same umbrella of Daoist magic, but like one is totally diametrically different from the other, but they're still all practicing the same. They're all practicing magic. And so, what was the question again?
Oh, that's okay. The question was, and you know what? Actually, let me frame this question for you so that I think this will help. I know that in certain, like you'd mentioned, in Golden Dawn, like let's say Golden Dawn and OTO or something, they would use, like let's say one would use the Enochian characters to maybe formulate a sigil. Another one could use, say, Hebrew characters or celestial writing to create a sigil. So it sounds like you kind of had a light bulb go off there. So.
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. I keep interrupting you, but
okay.
Yeah, there are different traditions, different lineages. We call them lineages, or factions, depending on how you want to do the translation. And it's complicated. It depends on who you ask. So what happened is in history, a lot of them started during either the Tang Dynasty or the Han Dynasty. And unfortunately, because of so many of the different wars throughout history, or the revolts, or when they were sort of stigmatized, or when their books were burned, or when they were excluded from the imperial library, a lot of got lost in history, got lost in space-time. And then if they weren't lost then by the Cultural Revolution, they were definitely lost. It was very, very hard after the Cultural Revolution to find a lot of the lineages fully intact that were thriving during the Han or the Tang dynasties. Now, there are lineages that span out of, for example, Taiwan. Now, Taiwan was, in a sense, immune. Well, the KMT came over, but we won't get into Chinese, cross-race history. But in Taiwan, they have certain lineages that have thrived, that have stayed in Taiwan for many, many centuries. So those tend to be more intact. They tend to be more, if you want to use the word authentic, if you will, to the ways it was practiced historically. But I think why Daoism has such a bad stigma in modern times is there's also, you have to be, truthful, right? There's a lot of fraud and there are a lot of charlatans as well. And so I think there are a lot of pay me $250 and I will ordain you as a celestial master and you can be part of my tradition, So there's a lot of that going on. So it's really difficult to parse through what's charlatans, what's kind of fraudulent and what's the true authentic tradition. For me, I feel like those who are truly part of a tradition don't talk about it and they don't like to advertise it and they probably don't have websites. I'm so sorry, but they're just not out there. You know what I mean? So, but that's my opinion. Opinion.
Right. Yeah. And I agree with you. I think that is one of the reasons why so many, well, I'm not going to say that. Why in particular, like Wicca will say outright, and it's very much ingrained into training, is that do not charge for training, because what it does is it infects it, and it either makes you feel like you have to put on a show, or you're just okay, I'm going to make $50 off this student, $50 off this student, so I want to get X amount of students, and just kind of feed them information so that they're happy, but you're not really training them. You're just kind of like you're using them as debit cards, you know? It's kind of like, okay, I got $200 coming in this week, and then, yeah. So it does, and it cheapens it, and I agree with you. I think that those who are serious about it, they are teaching it, and they are expecting the students to pursue them and to learn and to do everything. And if you have a payment system, it's just kind of like, no, you're reliant on getting a bunch of students, and you don't really care how hard they're working. It's just kind of like they're just money to you. They're cattle. So, yeah, I agree with you. We got a couple more things here. Okay, Renee Yin, hello, says, opinion of the wild Quan Yin oracle. Not to be confused by the Quan Yin oracle. I think that's the same deity, just a different pronunciation, but I'll let Benebell talk on that.
You know, I'm an author on a book tour, right? And I'm supposed to be politically correct. Like, do people know that? Like, I'm joking. If you look at history, historic scripture of Quan Yin says that she can transform and manifest in thousands and thousands of forms. And in her history and in scripture, Quan Yin can take any form that she needs, or that Quan Yin, this bodhisattva, needs to take in order to spread the message that the bodhisattva needs to be spreading, or to help the person that the bodhisattva wants to help. And so if you're looking from a scriptural perspective and a historic and scholarly and objective perspective, the manifestations of Quan Yin in both the original Quan Yin oracle, the one where she looks like a strumpet and she's like, you know, that one, and the wild Quan Yin, they're accurate to scripture. Mm-hmm. I think for people who are venerating Quan Yin and the culture that she has sort of come up in, the Chinese culture, a lot of people like to make the association with Mother Mary. You know, she's pure. She's very she's always like completely you know, covered head to, you know what I mean? She's just a very sort of like your mom. You don't want to, no matter what your mom looks like, or even nobody wants to see their own mother as like a centerfold pinup, you know? Like there's just certain ways you envision your own mother. And so for a lot of us, Quan Yin is like a mother figure. And so when we see certain manifestations of her from the Western perspective, it does get very uncomfortable. The wild Quan Yin, I think, is beautiful art. I think it's beautiful and scripturally is accurate because she can manifest in any form to send the message that she needs to send. So there's no qualms there. I think for me, it's just not the way I view her. It's not the way I relate to her. And it's not the way anybody in my entire family has ever related to her. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Did I answer that? Was that good? Was that a good answer?
I think that if I was going to rate that answer on a scale from 1 to 5, I think that was a 6.
Okay, so I stayed very polite and diplomatic, right?
Yeah, and it's really fascinating because I've been to Vietnam a couple of times with my girlfriend, and Quan Yin is very big there. And
yes.
I like that you had mentioned that the male aspect, because I forget what it was. There was one temple that we were at, but I was talking with my girlfriend and she was kind of describing it to me because I'd noticed that there was different images of her. One with kind of like holding a bottle up and a sort of a flower down, and they would drape them in cloth. The Quan Yin statues, but I think maybe that was more to protect them from the exhaust of cars and motorbikes, because there's a lot of them in Vietnam. But we were talking about the aspect of Quan Yin, and she had mentioned that Quan Yin was at one time male.
Yes.
And I was like, what? But especially in the West, we associate her so much with, like you said, Mother Mary, the female figure, the female the quote-unquote female stereotypes of motherhood, caring, loving, nurturing. We very much associate her with that. At least I do.
Mm-hmm.
So when she said that I say she, but when Quan Yin
It's
started
okay.
out male, I was like, really? I was really thrown by that.
The story that I grew up with, that I learned this actually at a monastery. So at a Buddhist monastery, this is what they taught. They taught that in history, there was this time, it's about Chinese history, men and women were not allowed to be in the same room as each other. And also women were seen as not fit to be presented before the eyes of God or the eyes of deity. So women were not actually allowed to be at temples or to venerate in any way. So, Quan Yin, because she is the bodhisattva of compassion and mercy, and she basically helps all of the, lowest of the low, she wanted to make sure that women were able to hear the word of, to basically be exposed to Buddhism. And so he transformed into a she so that she could be before both men and women, and she could help the most people. As a man, she could help less. As a woman, everyone can identify more with the female form. And so she transformed into a woman so that more people could be exposed to her. I guess I use the word gospel, but, just to be able to connect with deity and to connect with heaven. And I've always liked that story. So.
Yeah. And it's very interesting because then after I learned that, I kind of looked at, I keep saying her, but I kept looking at her in a different light. I kept seeing the dual aspect. The male and the female. So it was kind of like, I could see obviously the shape, the way that she was clothed. You could sort of see a shape of female in there. You could sort of see the curvature of the body and the breasts. You could sort of see that, but then you could also see just like the bulge of cloth and the shape of how the cloth fell. And so it was kind of like, okay, if I close my eye one way, it's male. If I close my eye the other, it's female. So it's very interesting. It's very interesting. So
I think we people use male, and we assign gender in the binary as male and female just because we're stupid and it's easier for us to understand things, right? And so we apply that same sort of construct to how we define and talk about deity or heaven, even though that may not necessarily be what is. We just use that vocabulary to describe something that is, but even though that is not what it is. And so people always talk about bodhisattvas and Buddhas as being genderless. There is no gender assigned to these Buddhas and bodhisattvas. We as people assign them genders just because we need it to understand and to connect to deity so that it's a little bit closer to home. Mm-hmm. So we did that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just had a great time when I was in Vietnam. Because there's so many temples there, and also I think, although I'll have to check with my girlfriend, but I think her family, because they're Chinese and Vietnamese,
that makes sense.
Yeah, her family was very much, I think they had a very Daoist, I'm thinking, and Buddhism mix, because they were very much into veneration of the family, veneration of the ancestors. But there was also the element of Chinese deities there. But we would go to Buddhist temples, and the Buddhist temples would still even have imagery of deities, So you would see deities guarding the temples, and there was four deities at one of these temples we went to. So there was a lot of mixed imagery that even though I wasn't familiar with it, I could tell like this sort of doesn't, you know what I mean? You could sort of see like putting it together. It's kind of like, okay, this doesn't exactly fit. This kind of looks a little orphan. So I could
it's like the veneration and communion of the ancestor worship is very, very Daoist, and it's very not Buddhist. Buddhism teaches detachment, and so it's just a very different principle from Buddhism. But what you see almost among so many of the traditional families, you'll see ancestor worship and then like a huge statue or placard of Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, or of Quan Yin, to look over their ancestors. So they mix everything together, and it's just or burning. So for example, burning offerings to your ancestors is very, very Daoist. That's not Buddhist. But people who identify strongly as Buddhist and would tell you they are Buddhist would still burn offerings to their ancestors when they have passed on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, oh, yes, right, exactly. And there was a death in the family, and there was a very extensive, very long whole process that they had to do for her to carry on to the next life. And I was impressed by that. It's kind of like in the Western culture, it's kind of like someone passes away, you have a funeral, maybe a wake, and then you kind of move on from it. For her, there was no. We have to do this for a week. We have to do this for a month. We have to do this for a year, and then we have to do it on the anniversary, and then every year. And I was like, wow, there's a lot of respect and a lot of connection with the ancestors and with those who have passed on in the family.
When my cat died, I went vegan for 49 days to accrue karmic merit for the cat. And I also did all of the rituals and the blessings and all the meditations and recitations that you would do. It's every 7th day for 49 days. And then after that, it's on the anniversary of their death, but it's also during the ghost month, and it's also during tomb sweeping day. And so they have a very close connection with their ancestors, and there is a very strong sense that they're still with us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of off topic, but do you practice like you mentioned when your cat had passed on, you gave up meat, you became vegetarian for a certain period of time. Is that part of your practice? Like, let's say where you want to have something happen, do you become vegetarian for a certain period of time during that? Or is that something that's completely different?
It's many things. So one of the beliefs is that you can accrue karmic merit on behalf of another. So what some people might do, for example, if you think a loved one might not have been that great of a person and might be doomed for not that great of an afterlife, and you want to save that person, or you want to show mercy and compassion, one of the things that you do is you accrue good karma. So you basically act in ways that can accrue good karma, but you say that's not for me. I know it makes no sense. Okay. So if you didn't grow up in this, it's absurd sounding, kind of like, resurrection, but
like us going to mass.
There's a lot of things that if you've never heard of it growing up, it's going to sound absurd, right? But yeah, we believe you can accrue good karma on behalf of another soul, as long as you have the intention and there's certain things, rituals that you do to do it for that soul. And so that's what you do. If you kill, right? Killing, harming is a form of bad karma. And so you go vegan in order to not harm, but that's not all of it. It's also, you only speak good. You don't speak ill of anybody. And when you speak ill, so basically you do all of these things to accrue good karma to ensure that your relative can go on to a much better afterlife. You hope that it's like an insurance policy, right? Mm-hmm. You're just giving them an insurance policy and sending it into the afterlife to make sure they go to someplace good.
Yeah, no, I do the same thing as you. I kind of like tell people, okay, like they ask me about like, what do Wiccans believe, or how does magic work, or, why do you do this? Why do you do that? And yeah, I mean, I at some point in the conversation, or maybe even at the beginning of the conversation, I'll say, this might sound crazy to you, but this is what I do. And it does. Yeah. I can completely understand that from the perspective of somebody listening to this, they're like, that doesn't make any sense. Why does it matter that you go clockwise this way and you do this? I mean, to an outsider, it seems like it's ridiculous. And so I have to understand that to someone else, yeah, it looks like completely ridiculous things. But for us, the practitioners, it's where we're doing something, we're saying something, but it has a purpose. It's it's not all chaos. There's actually order to it, and there's a reason and a purpose for it. And
yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
That's okay. I'll finish up here. And it's kind of like what we had talked about earlier, how you really have to understand the totality of, for example, the qi and the fu. You kind of have to have a very broad understanding of it all, and then from there you can begin to sort of change it and work with it. And it is definitely in the same way in witchcraft traditions and occult traditions, where you really have to have a very broad understanding of everything before you can go in and start changing and breaking the rules.
Yeah. And I think for me, because of the authoritarian pedagogy of the Chinese, they don't always teach you the how, which is what I hope my book does. But like they'll say like, oh, you have to, walk clockwise in these particular step formations, and then you knock on this 3 times, ring this bell, and then say this. And I'm like, why? You just do it. Don't do it. Like no one explains shit to you. Okay. You just do it that way. I'm like, no, I'm not doing it that way, because it doesn't make sense to me. But when I did my own study, I realized that there's this huge heritage to it. And, you walk a certain way because they believe in a magic square. It's based on geomancy. It's based on feng shui. There's a particular, the 4 directions all correspond with particular things. And the directionality, everything that you're doing is based on something so much bigger than yourself. And I think that's why I got drawn into it, because there is this huge, deep pool of wisdom and knowledge to what practitioners of craft and magic do. It's not arbitrary at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Exactly. It definitely does have a purpose. But from somebody from the outside, like if you were going to describe it to them, they would say, well, how does that do this? Or, so I have to understand that perspective of from the outside, it just looks like, crazy mumbo jumbo stuff. Because in a sense it kind of does, but there is a whole purpose to it.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I really also found another parallel was the magic squares that you were talking about in your book, and how it kind of came about. The guy saw the tortoise coming out of the water, and I guess the spots arranged themselves in numbers, and then it turned into the magic square. And I actually had run across that same story in another book. And so I was like, oh, fascinating. So, and how do magic squares sort of come into play in this?
So, wow, where do I begin? So there's the Bagua, the 8 trigrams. There's 2 forms of Bagua. There's 2 arrangements. One is the early heaven and one is the later heaven. The early heaven arrangement of the 8 elements describes nature in its natural form. It's nature untapped by man. Right? It's nature when you don't control it. When you practice Wu-wei, which I know you said earlier, non-action, when you practice non-action. Early heaven Bagua explains how fate and nature works when you go with the flow of nature. The later heaven Bagua is basically the magician's 8 elements. It's the same 8 elements rearranged, and it describes how you control nature. So not everyone understands how it looks or what it means, but if you can understand the later heaven Bagua, this is what they teach. If you can understand the later heaven Bagua, you can understand how to control nature. And so that's, evidently the one that most ceremonial magicians will use. And that one is, what were we talking about again?
Oh, I'm sorry. I threw you a curveball because it was completely out of left field. But I asked the question about the magic squares.
Oh, right. So then the later heaven Bagua, what ended up happening is they corresponded with those dots, and so the later heaven Bagua describes how you use magic, and that's where the magic square comes from. The magic square are the 8 trigrams with the center point, and the center point is spirit. So you know how they say 4 elements plus the 5th element of spirit? They'll say the 8 elements plus the 9th element of spirit. And by that, you have 9 squares. That creates the magic square. And the magic square, the 9 components, also corresponds with the 9 numbers. So it brings in numerology. It brings in astrology. It connects and corresponds with certain planets, or at least the sacred 7 traditional planets that, all of our forebears seem to have only known about, So it relates to every aspect of that. And the correspondences are in the book. And it just shows you how the 9 square is a symbolic representation of as above, so below.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, sorry, that was one of those questions where I kind of like, oh yeah, I forgot I gotta ask her that, so I kind of threw it in there, but we weren't exactly like leading up to it or even referencing it, so it was kind of like one of those questions.
It's a huge part of it. So the magic square is also used in Feng Shui. So when you're trying to understand the energies of a particular place, the magic square is a form of map to understand how energy interacts and what happens to energy in certain sectors of a given space. The magic square is also used in divination. You use it as a form of, fortune telling, of telling a person's future, of, telling them about their personality. You input, because it relates to the 9 numbers, remember? So you input their birth details into the magic square and you use the magic square to perform divination on people. And the magic square is also used in craft. So it corresponds, the 4 corners corresponds with north, south, east, west. So to protect the square, you first call upon the 4 quarters, the 4 celestial guardians to protect it. And then, certain forms of ritual are going to be, how you take certain steps during ritual is based on the 9 sectors of the magic square. So, yeah.
Okay. And it's really interesting you mentioned the planets. So does Taoism, esoteric Taoism, do they have the planets? Did they give the planets names? Or
so Venus, I don't remember. So Venus I know is metal. So you know how you have the 5 phases, 5 elements of Wu-Xing. You have the wood, fire, earth, metal, and water, right? So I believe metal was Venus, earth I think was Saturn, maybe. I can't remember. Fire is Mars for sure. So they correspond with the 5 planets other than the sun and moon, and then the sun and moon is the yin and yang. So it kind of corresponds with the sacred 7, the sacred 7 of traditional astrology.
Right, and also the five planets that we can basically see with the naked eye,
So the 5 elements correspond with the 5 planets you can see with the naked eye, and then the other 2, the sun and the moon, make up the 7.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating because some people don't know this, but the other planets weren't discovered till later on, till like 19th century, I think. So like Neptune and Uranus and Pluto, which maybe not a planet, but those that weren't really discovered till later on. Yeah. So let's see. We had a question. Green Ghost 2008 asked, "Wouldn't nature get all mad with people trying to control it?" I think that was a comment from later on, but it kind of brings up the question of, I don't know would you consider that Daoists, esoteric Daoists, try to control nature?
So, there's two ways I can answer that question. So the first is in the Huangdi Yinhu in the 13 principles, one principle is that before everything that happens, before every event, nature gives you an opportunity to change the outcome. And that kind of goes into the idea of free will. And I think that's maybe what it's playing to. So the idea is that before any given outcome, nature gives you, the man or human, the opportunity to change the outcome. And the second one of the traditional principles in that book was that you can change the course of nature if it's right, like if it's the right time and it's like good or something like that. But there are a couple of conditions that particular book and that particular magician said is okay to change nature. And so a lot of how I teach craft is based on those 13 principles. So as long as you can justify your action as adhering to those principles, and they're not religious principles. They're, in a way, they very much feel like scientific laws, in a sense, metaphysical laws. Okay. That's kind of how they feel. The other aspect is when you're talking about nature, that's when you have esoteric Daoism versus exoteric Daoism. Exoteric Daoism stresses non-action, and they do stress for you to go with nature, and that when it's hard, you need to be soft, and it does stress to be like water. That's exoteric Daoism. Esoteric Daoism, also under the umbrella of Daoism, is very different from that. It's in fact the polar opposite. The idea of esoteric Daoism is that man can ascend to a level where it can control heaven and nature. And so that's also why it's very controversial and why people tend to fear esoteric Daoism, because it's still operating under the umbrella of Daoism and using the principles and philosophy of Daoism, but it's taking a very dramatic turn saying, well, I'm going to show you how to ascend and overcome nature or control nature, so I don't think saying right hand versus left hand path is correct, but I just don't know I just don't know how to describe it. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, esoteric Daoism, the whole premise of esoteric Daoism is about controlling nature. And that's why it's controversial.
Right. And in a sense, yeah, I would say that is one of the, trying to relate it, like you said, about the left hand, right hand path. Or
it's hard.
It is hard, but it's kind of like, it's also, Go ahead.
No, you're right. I'm agreeing with you. It's kind of, you can kind of make that, correlation, but it's not a perfect fit.
Well, I think that because, people talk about white witchcraft and black witchcraft, I think that's kind of, it's kind of a hangover from Christianity, which is based in the Zoroastrian principle of the deity and the anti-deity. But we do kind of get wrapped up in this idea of looking at opposites, looking at you are selfless or you are selfish, or you are working towards a common goal for everyone, or you're working towards a common goal for yourself. So I mean, there's always kind of like these contrasts where, as I think that, and it sounds like the same thing in Daoism, where what you're trying to do is you're trying to kind of bring those and harmonize those together, and understanding how they relate to each other. And definitely in occultism, occult philosophy, there's very much that understanding of know thyself, looking at everything in a totality, and understanding that the wolf is a wolf. You can't expect the wolf to be not a wolf. A wolf is a wolf, and that the human aspect, you have to understand that we are selfish, but we are dependent upon each other, so you have to kind of understand that if you go too far to one extreme, if you become way too selfish, you're going to become isolated and no longer part of the group. Whereas if you are giving everything away to everybody, you have nothing for yourself later on when it comes to the heart of winter, when you have no food. So you have to understand the balance between those two,
And in the Eastern mystery traditions, I would say that because we are all populated by humans, we have the same arguments, we have the same debates that I see happening a lot in the Western pagan communities. So is there a difference between white magic versus black magic? Well, it depends on who you ask. My view is that it's like saying, is gravity good or evil? Is thermodynamics good or evil? Well, you push somebody off the side of a cliff, gravity suddenly just became really bad, but, but that's not gravity. It's still just an energy. So, magic and craft is about working with chi energy and how you use chi energy. And the yin and yang just describes energy as either creative or destructive. But that's not good and bad. Creative and destructive can both be used in ways that are ethically or morally good versus bad. Now, in terms of how some Chinese view it, and just to be, broad and objective, to look at it more historically. So within esoteric Daoism, you have some lineages that do incorporate a lot of Buddhism. And they believe that the way to ascend is through only doing good deeds. And they talk about good deeds, compassion, and benevolence. And they also talk about not interfering with nature, even though it's a form of esoteric. As Taoism, it's a form of inner cultivation to ascend to what they talk about as immortality. And so there's this idea that to ascend, you need to only do good. You cannot use craft to harm people. You cannot do any form of harm. If you do harm, you're going to only diminish your own power, your own magic. And magic isn't something that's power. It's just an incidental acquisition that you get the farther you ascend. And so you just don't use it. You just happen to acquire it because you're on a different mission. So if you ascend, then you happen to coincidentally acquire stronger power, magical abilities or powers, but that's not something that you would ever use. Now, there's also other forms. There's lineages, for example, Gudao. That's called poison magic. And you use poison. I mean, it's exactly what it sounds like. Poison magic is the very focused study of how to poison people and how to use poison in both in both a literal sense and also a more magical sense. It's a form of retaliatory, or it's a darker form of magic. It's about basically throwing cancers and tumors, and I'm using those words figuratively, at people and using poison as a form of magic. There's another form called thunder magic, and they worship a deity like the god of thunder, like basically the Chinese version of a god of thunder, and you use thunder magic. And thunder magic it's generally used to dispense justice, and that's also nuanced as well. It's basically saying when somebody has not received their just desserts, you can use thunder magic to invoke the thunder god to make sure that person gets what they deserve. Is that good or bad? That's,
Right, right, exactly. It's good for the one who suffered the injustice, but maybe it's not good for the person who did it, who committed that
right.
injustice. But yeah, so you mentioned that poison magic. Now, is that also, for example, I'll use the example that you used, but maybe in a different context, of the cancer. So would somebody, say, use a poison magic to focus onto the cancer to kill it, not necessarily the person? Could people do that, or is that a representation of a darker sort of not darker, I shouldn't say that, of a sort of malicious form of just wishing people harm in period?
That's a tough question, and here's why. Because the greater public opinion would probably be that poison magic is a darker form of craft, but people are not just pure good, pure evil. Like, people are just people, right? And we're all capable of the broad spectrum of activities. And so practitioners of poison magic use poison magic for all sorts of purposes. And I can't define what those purposes are. If they're using it to, in a form, kill a cancer, where you use poison to fight poison, that's not necessarily like a bad or evil, or you can't really make a negative moral judgment of that, right?
Right.
So you can use, just in terms of, just like theoretically, of course you can use poison magic for things that are for a greater good, for things that we consider morally good, right? But I think to be honest, when you look at it from, how people view things, just like there are certain traditions or practices within paganism that people consider darker. But then if you really boil down to the individual, it's not like that person's going around like doing, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's nuanced. You would have, the broader scheme is that they're not afraid to get down and dirty, but they're not going there every single day of their lives. So you can use poison magic for good. You can use poison magic to heal, to fight, to dispense justice. But there is a greater social stigma against that kind of craft.
I understand. I agree with you, and I think I understand what you mean by that. Okay. It's really now I just lost my thought. It's the tool. It's the tool.
Yeah.
There's a tool for everything, and sometimes you need a tool to cut, and sometimes you need a tool to sew back together. And that's how I look at it for myself. I look at using magical energy in that sense. And sometimes I kind of cringe. I hear people, they talk about binding hexes and curses. It's like, those are not your only 3 options. You have other options. Those are not the only 3 things that you can do. There are so many different ways to be creative, to cause a change that you believe needs to occur. And it's not always a binding or a hexing or a cursing. Sometimes there's other ways to do it. And hexing and binding and cursing is a very specific tool that has a specific purpose that is used for specific situations. And just to use those at the drop of a hat it doesn't really serve any good purpose for you. It doesn't serve a good purpose for the other person, but it is a part of practice. People have said that if you can't harm, you can't heal. And it's the same thing. If you can't heal, you can't harm. So you have to be able to understand both parts of those extremes. So let me see.
I think that. I think so. I don't know if I don't. My opinion.
You can't. No, you can't disagree with me. I'm just kidding.
Well, I just feel like, I don't even know how to describe it. I think I see it as a lot of the ethics that I've seen a lot of Daoist practitioners follow is very similar to like law, like just law, like for example, I don't run around the streets like hitting people. I'm not violent. I don't just walk up to somebody and punch them in the face. But I think there's a time and there's a place for self-defense. And I think that tends to be what more governs craft. Now, in terms of like, you can't heal somebody unless you know how to harm.
Mm-hmm. Right. Exactly.
It depends. So like, what do you mean by that? Do you mean like you've actually, I guess I don't even know what that means, because how do you not know how to harm? Who doesn't know how to harm?
Oh, I'm sorry.
You know what I'm saying? Like, like who doesn't, like when you say you can't heal unless you harm, and you can't harm unless you know how to heal, like who doesn't, like I just don't really, I guess I don't understand. I don't understand that. I don't understand the distinction, because like energy is energy. How do you, I don't understand what do you mean by that? You know what I'm saying? Like you can either use it, of course, I don't know. I think of course it's true, but then it just seems like a weird thing to say.
I see what you're saying about that. Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah.
I'm not articulating, like it's like you don't know how to drop a ball unless you know how to throw it up.
Yeah, I definitely can understand what you mean. I think it's just kind of a way of describing that people should not be afraid of one and accepting of the other. Maybe it's to kind of relay that, because yeah, you're absolutely right. It's kind of, how to harm. It's just kind of, yeah, right, exactly. You do know how to do it. I think it's just kind of a way of expressing to someone that, to not be afraid of it, or to understand it in a different aspect. The way I perceive it is that what that means is you have to understand how to I don't know. I don't think there's any way I can really recover that statement.
No, I understand. No, I see. The funny thing is, I understand what you're saying, and I agree with it. You know what I mean? Like I agree with it. Mm-hmm. It's just a funny way of putting it to me. To me, it's a funny way of putting it, because it is what it is, right? Mm-hmm. It's like everyone knows how to. In a way, everyone knows kind of how to throw a punch. Like I mean, or not even throw a punch. If I needed to like subdue somebody, I know how to subdue somebody, but I can choose to forbear forbearance is a different thing. I can forbear from hitting somebody. I can forbear from hurting somebody, but that doesn't mean I don't know how.
Right.
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 So.
Right. Yeah, I think that one of the key aspects of that is it's also sort of understanding how. Like, yes, everybody knows how to ball up a fist or pick up a stick and whack somebody with it. But those who are, say, who have studied fighting, or say take a martial art, they know where to hit somebody that it's going to disable them or incapacitate them or paralyze a part of their. You know what I mean? There are very specific points that they understand that if they hit those points, it's going to cause this effect. Or if somebody attacks them, they know how to defend themselves in such a way where the other person is going to put themselves in a harm's way. And I think that that's where that understanding of knowing how to heal and knowing how to harm, because sometimes we have to harm people, not in the sense of physically hit them, but sometimes you need to kind of give them a little nudge, kind of like, you have to do this. If you don't do this, this is going to happen. And I think it's kind of understanding that, and a binding and a curse and a hex. Those three things is, one is a binding, which basically can immobilize someone and cause that person to freeze and not be able to react to a certain situation, where maybe what you actually want to do is change their consciousness or change their approach, or maybe make them treat somebody in a kind fashion, or maybe turn themselves in for a certain action that they have done. So doing a binding in that aspect is actually not helping the situation at all. You may want to do something where what they do is for example, like let's say there's somebody who's been going around breaking into cars. You don't necessarily want to bind that person. You want them to be exposed. You want light to be shined on them, and for them to be noisy, and you want them basically to get caught. So you would do something to cause that sort of change. I guess that's kind of like what I was sort of getting at.
I understand why I got confused now. I know where there was the the disconnect. So when I see that, I see it as levels of ability, you know. Mm-hmm. So you're right, and I agree with that statement, because if you don't know any of it, like I don't know how to throw a punch. I don't know how to throw a punch, but I also can't fight, and I can't defend. I can't protect somebody with my physical abilities, right? And so that's more of a testament to my ability. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So it's not about will, it's about my ability. So I don't have the ability to do any of that stuff. And so that's why I didn't understand the statement. If you have the ability to heal, you have studied and cultivated craft to such an advanced degree, then absolutely you know how to harm as well, because you understand craft, you understand the ontology of craft, and you know how to scrutinize a person's essential nature and figure out exactly what you need to do to modify that nature toward a particular intent or outcome. And so yes, you can. I absolutely agree with you. I just saw it as a difference in level, because if you're at a high level where you are able, for example, to heal, you can forbear. So if you see somebody breaking into a car, certain lineages, certain people, certain practitioners will say, I'm not going to do anything. I forbear. I have the magical ability to do something about that, but I'm going to forbear and not do anything because I'm going to let that run the course of nature. And then others will say, well, I'm going to do something about it, you know, and I'm going to do something. And then what you do runs the whole gamut. You can go out there and shoot him down with like an AK-47, right? Or you can do something that kind of minimizes harm all across the board. But it's just different levels of dealing with the situation. So that's how my perspective, that's why I think I got confused. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. But I agree.
Yeah. Yeah. And absolutely. And I think in some sense, healing work it takes a lot more understanding. For example, like let's say somebody has a certain type of blood disorder that well, maybe you see. I mean, I don't even know anatomy that well But what I'm trying to convey is that you would need to know whether you need to strengthen their own their own defenses that their own body is producing to combat a sickness, like let's say a severe flu, or in the sense of like, let's say a cancer or a disease that is taking over. So you would want to know whether you need to send them healing energy to strengthen their body, or if you need to send energy to harm and to kill the invading virus into the body. You know, and so you kind of, so if you're going to do healing on people, you also sort of have to understand kind of anatomy and what it is that they're suffering from in order to be able to heal them, you know.
That's why I don't believe in like good versus bad or light versus dark. I think it's creative or destructive. You use energy either in a creative way or you use energy in a destructive way. Healing sometimes it requires creative energy, sometimes it requires destructive energy, but that's just the description of the energy being used. It's not necessarily, there's no moral attachment to it. I think the moral attachment comes from the human that is operating. And it comes from our intentions and how we use it in a way to whether the way we use it is, you know, selfish or is harming somebody. You know what I'm saying? It's more of a description of ourselves and the practitioner than it is, or the practitioner's act. It's a description of the practitioner's act and not the craft itself. Because craft itself is either creative or destructive.
Definitely. Well, Benebell, I have to tell you, it has been wonderful talking with you. I think you're a wonderful, very intelligent woman, and I've really enjoyed talking with you about this. And again, I'm going to plug your book again, The Tao of Craft. I think this is really well written, and I'm very impressed with this. And like I said, there's a lot of information in here, and I have not read it all yet. I'm just going to be honest with you, I haven't. I was only able to read a part of it, but what I've read so far has been incredible, and I'm really looking forward to finishing it. And so yeah, thank you so much. We are at the 9:30 mark right now, so I think we should. Yeah, I know we've been talking for like 2 hours, so. Let's go ahead.
No one's going to watch this.
Huh?
No one's going to watch this. No one's going to watch this. It's going to be like 2 hours. Hell no. No. What happens is, like, usually when I watch Google Hangouts or I watch these interviews, what I do is I just turn it on and I go and fix dinner, and I just listen to it. Yeah. So it's just audio. It's just audio to me, because you know you don't really have to see people unless you really want to, but you can just like listen to it in the background. And I do that sometimes at night. I'll watch an interview, so people will watch it. But let's go ahead and wrap this up. Is anything coming down the horizon, or what's coming up next for you? Not much, just, continue blogging and, just practicing what I practice. But, thank you so much for having me on your channel. I'm such a fan of your channel, and I've been watching it forever. So it's really kind of surreal to have been watching a channel and then now be on it. So that's kind of a weird experience.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have my channel has so many different facets to it. I've been trying to do interviews more and more, and it's one of the things that I enjoy doing, because I enjoy talking with people from all different aspects, and I think it really is nice to be able to get different perspectives from everybody. And so this is definitely something that I've been trying to do more and more of. So.
Yeah, that's very cool. And I think this is so for me, when I didn't want to publish the book. I didn't want it out there it was actually the publisher and then, Divination that, convinced me, but I was very hesitant. And then after the book, I was like, oh man, this means I now have to talk about the book. And to talk about the book, it means I have to talk about like my practice and my views. But when you talk about craft, it's so controversial and it's so personal. You know what I'm saying? Like, I just really didn't want to be part of it. I didn't want to talk about these topics, you know, in a public forum, but you made it very comfortable. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I will. We'll have to talk again sometime about this. Definitely after I've read this book some more. Would you be open to that?
Yeah, sure. Of course.
Wonderful. Yeah, because I would love to talk to you again about this book, and then we can explore some other things. Because I think that we could definitely go on for another 2 hours, but you know, we both have responsibilities, and I gotta cook dinner. So.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So, Benebell, again, thank you so much. You've been a wonderful guest, and thank you so much. And,
thank you.
And to all of you out there, whoever's still watching, and thank you for your questions. It was a lot of fun. So, thank you so much, Benebell. All right.